This is a production of Cornell University.
Thanks, Tony. It's really good to be back at Cornell and back in my home department, or section now, Soil and Crop Sciences. So thanks everyone for being here. And today, like Tony said, I'm sharing results from my dissertation, which I completed last summer, looking at invasive plants and white-tailed deer. So, to begin with, I just want to thank my committee. Dave Mortensen and Erica Smithwick were my co-advisors at Penn State, and I had a lot of help with this project, from lots of field assistants to several contributors of data. A lot of scientists in the region shared their large plant community data sets with me, so I'm really grateful for those contributions. And also for, this might be advancing automatically. And also for the other support I received at Penn State, both funding and otherwise. So invasive plants are associated with a lot of changes, both at the ecosystem level and within the plant community, such as altered plant, animal, and microbial communities. Biodiversity is often associated with plant invasions, and ecosystem processes can also be influenced. I'm apologizing for this advancing. Let me just switch this presenter view. If I can. Okay, let's go back here for a second. So, although all of these changes are occurring alongside plant invasions, we don't necessarily know that plants are the drivers. And so the question is whether other processes, such as changing disturbance regimes or altered community assembly factors, such as landscape configuration and deer browsing, might actually be the ultimate drivers causing ecosystem changes often associated with invasive plants. So deer are quite abundant, and for example, at Valley Forge, the current deer density is 84 deer per square kilometer. And this is several orders of magnitude higher than pre-European settlement deer densities, which were often less than 10 deer per square kilometer, often around 5. And in nearby areas in Ithaca, actually there are about 100 deer per square mile in certain places. So deer populations, as many of you know, are quite high. And they can have big effects on plants, especially in forest understories where deer take shelter. And you can see in this Ohio forest a very strong browse line as a result of heavy deer pressure. So this can reduce the number of shrubs and herbs in forest understories, causing impacts on other animals that rely on those species for habitat. And also this can create a window of opportunity for invasive plants. And indeed, there are a lot of examples of plant invasions in forest understories, such as this is Japanese barberry in Connecticut, garlic mustard, which many of you are probably familiar with. There are yearly pulls of garlic mustard in the Finger Lakes, and Japanese stiltgrass. This is in southeastern New York, and this grass and the others are potentially facilitated by selective deer browsing. So why are there so many deer across the landscape? And to show this, I just want to give you an idea of how the landscape has changed since pre-European settlement. Currently, there's a lot of agricultural cover, whereas there used to be large contiguous tracts of forest. So in the yellow here, you see agricultural land. The red and the pink indicate developed land cover, whereas the blue and the green are much less apparent in this map. Yet that used to be the prevailing land cover across the landscape. So deer are responding to this change in landscape configuration because the foraging quality is much better along forest edges and in open habitats, including crop fields. Deer can be quite problematic in both soy and in corn even, and especially in cover crops. Deer can cause quite an impact. In addition, invasive plants are also responding to changes in landscape configuration. So especially over the last century, both deer and invasive plants have basically gotten a huge advantage by the effects that humans have had on changing landscape composition and configuration. So broadly, my research falls into the overarching field and ecology of community assembly. And what I'm showing here is the 3 major selection factors that go into determining the local plant community. So first, plant species must disperse and move to a certain location, and then they must tolerate the environment there, so they must have a physiological tolerance for that site. And then within the ecological species pool, these species compete and also must cope with natural enemies, such as deer in the case of plant communities, and only then will the local plant community be realized. So I'm focusing my research in this area where I'm looking at the effect of deer on plants. So spatially, deer are responding to the landscape by choosing which landscapes and communities offer the best foraging opportunities, and also weighing those against other requirements they have for finding mates and shelter. So my research today I'll be sharing occurred at 3 different foci. So the first part of my work is at the plant community scale, at the plant community level, where I looked at unfenced and fenced plots from across the region, and I'll be showing you those results first. Then I zoomed in to look at whether deer preferences are helping to explain plant abundance patterns that are occurring in plant communities across the region. And then lastly, I stepped back to consider the context of landscape and the effect of deer on introduced plants. So first, across the region, what are the effects of deer on introduced and native plants at the community level? So first, I want to show you an example of a fenced and unfenced plot. This is a fenced plot on the right, and you can see a very clear dividing line in this slide better than the other. And I have to say this deer has been superimposed just for illustrative purposes. But in the plot on the left, you notice a lot of Japanese stilt grass. And this plant has grown almost all the way up to the fence edge, and then it almost completely stops in this case. There's hardly any Japanese stilt grass occurring inside the fence where deer have been excluded. So this is a really striking difference in the plant community composition and structure, and it appears that deer browsing, their selective browsing, might have facilitated the invasion. So how might deer facilitate plant invasion? Again, they're very selective browsers. They browse only species they find palatable and avoid other species, which then gain a competitive advantage in the plant community. So the effects of deer include changing competitive hierarchies in the plant communities. And this can have the result of limiting forest understory diversity and creating windows of opportunity for exotic plants to invade. Again, there are ecosystem processes that are influenced, and the decreasing stability in some of those processes can, again, invite plant invasion. So some studies have already looked at the effects of deer on invasive plants, showing that in many cases deer increase plant invasion, such as by increasing the cover of garlic mustard and Japanese stiltgrass. However, at other sites, there have been no effects or conflicting effects within studies, such as at one site, multiflora rose was increased, and at another site, which happened to be older, it was not the same pattern. So the really interesting study is that in some cases, in this particular case, deer decreased oriental bittersweet. Oriental bittersweet is another invasive plant, and it appeared that deer presence actually decreased the abundance. So my work aims to bring clarity to some of these equivocal results in the literature, and also to more broadly understand the role of deer in plant invasion across the region. Whereas these studies only used 1 or 2 sites, my intention was to use sites from across the region. So this is a map of those 24 sites, and I collected data at these 2 sites in northwestern Pennsylvania, but again, like I said, most of the data sets were contributed by other scientists. In this first part of my work, I hypothesized that deer would alter plant community composition, and in doing so, they would facilitate plant invasion and of introduced plants and reduce the abundance of native plants, diversity and abundance of native plants. So the data comprised 229 paired plots. So that's a total of 458 plots across the 24 sites. And although the experiments varied quite widely in the purposes for the experiment in the first place and the duration, all of the sites had in common that they had fenced and unfenced plots. Not sure what's going on here, sorry about that. So the commonality was they all had fenced and unfenced plots, and they all measured woody and herbaceous vegetation. So again, the data sources varied, the duration of the experiments varied, but I'm controlling for that, as you'll see, with a random effect approach. So using data from lots of different sources can be very unwieldy, and this was a really big challenge, particularly in that different plant abundance metrics were used across the 24 data sets. At 14 sites, stem density was used to estimate plant abundance, whereas in many other sites, cover was used, or cover classes. So this is an example of all of the let me mute this. Okay, we have some background noise. So these are the cover classes used across the data sets, and as you can see, they've really varied from experiment to experiment. So I tried to combine all of the abundance metrics into, oh boy. Yeah, it might sure, be a Mac issue.
It happens to me sometimes.
Gather windows? Do I want to do that?
No, in this room. Yeah, in this room. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to the data analysis. So to look at plant community composition, I used an indicator species analysis. And this determines the species that are associated with certain treatments. So in my case, I'm looking at the species that are associated with the deer treatment, plus deer in the control plots, and without deer in the fenced plots. And to look at species and community levels, I used mixed model analysis of variance, and looked at both plant species and community levels, though today I'll only have time to talk about that plant community level in addition to community composition. So just briefly, I used fixed the fixed effect as deer, but the random effects were plot, pair, and site. So I'm controlling for the within site variability as well as between site variability. And the between site variability, I think, is where a lot of the noise might come in if I wasn't controlling for those as random effects. So first, in summary, about 700 plant taxa were recorded across the 24 sites. 383 of those were native and 111 were introduced plants. And there's a big gap there. You'll notice a lot of the species, unfortunately, over 200 could not be identified down to species level. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but I think that tells us to a certain degree where the state of our taxonomy expertise lies in going out and collecting this data. Unfortunately, that occurred, but I'm focusing on the species that we could identify to the level of either being introduced or native. And about 18 species were present in plots where deer occur. 2 additional species were occurring where deer were excluded on average, and those were native species. You'll notice that there were about 3 introduced plants whether deer were present or not. And interestingly, a lot of taxa were only occurring where deer were present or absent. So 14% of the 700 taxa occurred only where deer were present, not occurring where deer were excluded. And then similarly, 18% of the species occurred only where deer were absent. So I'm beginning to show you the differences between deer and no deer plots, and you can already see that deer have a very big impact on plant community composition. So first, here I'm showing you the indicator species analysis results, and I'm beginning with the 6 introduced species that are indicators of deer presence. And you'll notice that 3 of these 6 are considered highly invasive. And they're also occurring across a lot of the 229 deer plots and across a lot of the sites. So these are some of the most widely spread invasive plants in the region, at least in forest understories. And there were several native species associated with deer. So these are the species that you're more likely to see across the landscape, and they're more likely to persist despite high deer pressure. And in contrast, they're occurring across many fewer of the plots and sites. So they're not as widely distributed across the region as are the invasive plants. And these are some of the more frequent species: oxalis, clearweed, coralberry, and stinging nettle. So these species are ones that I might consider planting because they're probably going to persist in the face of deer better. So as far as where deer were excluded, there were 5 introduced plants strongly associated with that treatment. And again, 3 of them, happen to be 3, are considered highly invasive. And these are Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, and multiflora rose. And I have a picture of a bird on a fence here because the birds might be contributing to the presence of these fleshy fruited species inside fenced plots. Birds might preferentially land on the fence because it's a perch point in itself, or within the plants that are growing inside the fence, which are vegetation is much more dense inside the plots, so there are more perch points. So that might be one explanation why there are fleshy fruited invasives occurring in forest understory, mostly forest understory plots. So far I had shown 6 invasive plants that were or 3 invasive plants associated with no deer plots, 3 associated with the absence of deer, but there are 27 native plants associated with the absence of deer, suggesting that the natives are more susceptible to deer browse than the exotic plants. And these are some of the more frequent native species associated with the absence of deer: white ash, spicebush, black cherry, and even poison ivy, suggesting that deer might find these species particularly palatable, or in the case of spicebush, maybe birds are again helping to disperse these species to where deer have been excluded because of additional perch points. So overall, we're seeing big differences in in introduced plants and native plants. The native plants appear to be more impacted by deer than the introduced plants. At the community level, I'm seeing similar results. The introduced species richness did not change, whether deer were present or not, and absolute introduced plant abundance was also unaffected. And this corresponds to what I was seeing in the indicator species analysis results. Approximately the same number of introduced plants are associated with each of those treatments. And there happen to be three in each of invasive plants. However, deer had a big negative impact on native plant abundance and plant species richness. Deer decreased native plant abundance in all three of the abundance metrics. And again, this is reflecting what I was showing in the indicator species analyses. Total plant species richness and abundance also declined, and mostly that was due to the native plants. So there's a difference here in how deer are impacting exotic plants and native plants. And it translates to a proportional increase in the invadedness of plant communities. So the proportion of introduced plant cover and midpoint is higher where deer are present. So even though deer didn't influence the absolute abundance of exotic introduced plants, they're increasing the relative abundance of introduced plants. So they're increasing the degree of plant invasion, or in other words, the invadedness of plant communities. This wasn't the same for plant stem density. And one explanation for this is that deer might increase the foliage on a plant, but not necessarily kill the stem. So the stem might persist even though the overall cover of that individual stem is reduced. So there's a bigger deer effect on cover than on stem density. Might be one way to interpret this. So revisiting the hypotheses that I first laid out for this particular part of my research, I did find that deer alter plant community composition, and a couple caveats in this second hypothesis: deer facilitated the invasion of some species, and at the community level they increased the relative abundance of invasive plants, not the absolute abundance. And lastly, there were definitely reductions in native plant diversity and abundance in the face of deer. So my next question is whether deer preferences can help explain some of these patterns that I observed across the region. So that's the second part of my research. I'm just going to show this briefly. I won't go through it all, but please ask me questions about this particular project, because this was a really interesting and fun experiment. I set up deer preference trials at the deer pens at Penn State, where they have captive deer. And I used 15 different plant species offered to the deer in a cafeteria style multiple choice preference trial. So I used introduced species and native species, some that were expected to be palatable, others that were expected to be unpalatable from both groups. And I'll show you an example of the feeding. Let's see if this video will work. They didn't always feed at the same time, but there were always 2 deer in the pen. They were too scared to be in a pen alone, as it turns out. so they didn't have regular feeding. You could see them eating blackberry here and honeysuckle here. Honeysuckle turned out to be one of their favorites, surprisingly. So I'm showing you the results here based on an electivity index, which takes into account the total amount of biomass offered within each trial and the amount of biomass offered for each individual plant. And it takes into account how much was eaten of each species relative to the other species. So a positive value indicates that the deer preferred that species. 0 indicates random feeding or feeding in proportion to that amount offered. And 0 indicates the plant was avoided. So here I'm just showing the overall results. And you can see that the invasive introduced species on average tended to be more avoided than the native species, which, especially in the spring, were more often selected than the invasive introduced species. But there was an interaction at the level of season and species. So I'm showing here the results, the same results, but with species. You'll see the 15 species that I included in the trials on the bottom, and within each group, invasive and native, I saw quite a range of plant palatabilities and deer preferences for these plants. And I've arranged them here according to deer preference within each group. I could talk a lot about deer preferences and the particular plant traits, but I'm just going to focus on the most preferred and the most avoided species. So bush honeysuckle, European privet, and oriental bittersweet were the most preferred species. And again, you'll notice these all have fleshy fruits. And of the native species, red maple was a little bit of a surprise to find that it was the most palatable of the natives. In the literature, there have been suggestions that it's not that palatable of a species. But again, this is all relative to just these species that I included in the trials. And the deer were not starved, just so you know. They had plenty of hay and regular food, but so these were all somewhat of treats, given they were given an opportunity to have some real plant material, not just hay and pellets. So of the species that were avoided, Japanese stiltgrass, garlic mustard, and Japanese barberry were highly avoided. And it seemed that based on some additional data we collected of the feeding behavior, it was the deer quickly learned that these species were ones to be avoided. And this might explain why across the region we're seeing that these species increase in the face of deer. They're unpalatable, they're avoided relative to other species, so they gain a competitive advantage in the plant community. And of the native species, hay-scented fern was the least palatable, and this is interesting because it's a species that has been noted as a native invader. And this is one of the 24 deer research sites. This is in northwestern Pennsylvania, where you can see the fence plot, kind of tried to outline that on the left, where there are a lot more plants, shrubs, and yet where deer are occurring, there's a lot of hay-scented fern. There are no introduced plants at this site, but there is a lot of hay-scented fern. So I think one point we might take from this is that deer can cause an increase in a plant species, whether it's native or introduced, if that plant is unpalatable. So the unpalatability seems to be more important than whether the plant was introduced or not. So deer are making choices at the species level, not at the level of introduced or native. So just to sum up this deer preference section, yes, deer feeding preferences can help us understand what's going on in the plant communities across the region as far as plants that increase or decrease in the face of deer. And deer preferences vary at the species level, not at the native introduced level. And the process of plant invasion can really be informed by understanding the processes going on at this very small patch level. So in this last part of my research, I just wanted to share a little bit of my findings based on interactions that are occurring between deer and landscape configuration. So deer aren't interacting with plant communities in a bubble. There are other factors going on surrounding these sites. So what is the importance of deer given the context of landscape fragmentation? So I'm stepping back here, looking at the landscape scale. And what do I mean by fragmentation? Well, first, it can imply a loss of habitat, changing landscape composition, such as forests being replaced by ag or developed land cover. And also, fragmentation implies broken apart landscape patches, such as a decrease in patch connectivity and increasing edge habitat, which I mentioned is something that facilitates both deer and invasive plants. So briefly, these are the metrics that I used to describe landscape fragmentation, both landscape structure and landscape composition metrics. I think I should move on and not talk too much about this right now. But again, deer and invasive plants are responding to landscape fragmentation, and it seems that because deer were shown to have impacts on plant communities across the region, that this is something we should really consider. What's going on surrounding the sites? So I hypothesized here that both landscape attributes and deer would jointly influence plant invasion, and high deer density, not just deer presence or absence, which I only focused on in the first part of my research, will increase plant invasion. So I used the same data from the 24 deer research sites, and each site had an independent estimate of the number of deer per square kilometer at each of the sites. So I used those data as well as national land cover data, I used mini landscapes to describe the surrounding fragmentation at each of these sites. For instance, this is the Ithaca land cover tile. You'll see the airport, the mall, and there's a deer exclosure site located right here within this landscape. The pink and the red are developed cover. As you can see, Cornell is down here near the edge, and yellow and brown represent the agricultural land cover, while green represents forested cover. So this is the whole range of landscapes surrounding the 24 sites, and you can see they range broadly in the amount of forested cover, agricultural cover, and developed cover. Some of them are much closer to centers of high human population density, and some are very isolated from the influence of humans. Some of these sites had no introduced plants at all. Others had many introduced plants. So I used several different approaches to analyze this data. I'm just going to focus on some results from the mixed models and regression, but I'll give you a summary of the overall results. Ordination visualizations helped me see that there are multiple invasive plants occurring at a lot of these sites, and the sites have, or the plots are much more similar in community composition to others within that site than across sites. So each of the sites are very different in plant community composition. As far as what I found from random forest results, this is a regression tree analysis-based approach to look at the relative importance of different variables. And I found that landscape fragmentation metrics and native species richness were more strongly associated with plant invasion metrics than was deer presence absence. So that tells you something right there. At the landscape level, perhaps the effect of deer isn't as important. And Exotic species richness, interestingly, was explained largely by landscape factors, but also by native species richness. And in this model, I had a very high R² value, so leads me to think that these three factors are quite important in understanding the number of species, the number of exotic species at a site. However, in the mixed model analyses, there were interactions among deer presence, absence, the fragmentation metrics, and native species richness. So I'm going to show you one example of that here. Overall, as agricultural land cover increases, the invasion, in this case, it's the percent of introduced stems, or the proportion of the stems that are introduced, increase with agricultural cover. So overall, there's a positive relationship here. But within each of the sites, the effect of deer plays an important role. This interaction was significant between deer and agricultural cover. So at the sites where ag cover is minimal, mostly forested sites, we're seeing that the number of introduced stems, the percentage of introduced stems is higher than where agricultural land cover is much greater. So there's a switch. You see the white symbols are higher than the gray symbols where ag cover is low, and the opposite where ag cover is high. So what might be causing this relationship? One explanation is that the invaders, the invasive species, vary across this gradient. And indeed, at these sites where deer were present, Japanese stiltgrass and garlic mustard were the invaders. Whereas in the higher agricultural land cover landscapes, these species, Japanese honeysuckle and multiflora rose, are more abundant where deer have been excluded. And again, I think this might be a result of bird dispersal. These species are more common along edges and in open habitat, so it's not surprising that the propagular pressure of these species would be higher in a landscape covered more by agricultural and open land. And to look at not just deer presence absence, but also to make use of the deer density data that was available, I found that as deer density increased, so did the cover of introduced plants and the percent of introduced species. And this wasn't found for all of the metrics that I used to look at plant invasion, but it was a significant relationship here, suggesting that deer density does make a difference. So overall, in revisiting the hypotheses, landscape attributes and deer presence were both important in considering landscape configuration, and deer preference and deer presence. We can more fully understand what's going on with plant invasion. And just a couple final points here. The surrounding landscape composition can help explain why some sites are invaded and others are not. And we get a much better understanding of plant invasion by considering the factors going on at a landscape scale. So in conclusion, deer increase the abundance of several invasive plants but reduce others. Deer are indirectly facilitating plant invasion because of the major decrease they have in native plants, and deer preferences are helping to explain those patterns. And then at the landscape scale, both deer abundance and exotic plant or introduced plant invasion are linked to the overarching structure and composition of the surrounding landscape. And invaders differ according to both the landscape and according to deer preferences. So I think considering both of these is really important. Understanding the plant invasion process is strengthened when we examine it in light of co-occurring multiscalar ecological patterns and processes such as landscape fragmentation and increasing deer populations. So perhaps forest fragmentation and deer browsing are the ultimate drivers of a lot of the ecosystem changes that we see in association with plant invasion. So it's just, I think, important to think a little bit broadly about whether it's really the plants that are driving these changes, or are they just passengers kind of along for the ride as a result of other changes. And lastly, managing invasive plants might be ineffective unless we're also managing for changes in landscape structure and composition and the increasing deer populations. So maybe one way to ask a final question is, what's more desirable, having very little growing where there's very clear browse lines and forest understories, or having introduced plants growing? So of course this is kind of an exaggerated either or, but I think because there's an window of opportunity in a lot of forest understories because of the high deer pressure, the result is having invasive plants. But maybe the invasive plants have are offering some services that we've overlooked, and Tony and I have talked about how that might be an interesting path to go down from here on. So with that, I hope there are minutes for questions, but it doesn't look like there are. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask me now or later, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, if honeysuckle and multiflora rose are so desirable from the deer's point of view, why are they so abundant in the land?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot over the past few years, and one explanation is that they're typically higher light environment species, and whereas I studied the plant communities and forest understories for the most part, there might be a difference there between high light and low light environments. I think in high light environments, those species tend to grow really quickly. So they might just be able to outgrow any of the deer browsing that occurs in those open habitats, because I have noticed in walking through fields even that there is deer browse occurring on those species, but maybe it's just not enough. The deer don't want to eat 100% of their diet of one shrubby invasive plant. They can only eat so much of it.
I think one of the issues of deer pressure is actually forest regeneration. So are there lessons from your study that would relate to forest regeneration?
Yeah, definitely. I think the high deer pressure is a really big concern in reducing the native species that we'd prefer to regenerate the forests. Instead, it looks like there are a couple exotic trees or invasive trees that might be taking the place of our native trees. But yeah, I think my research really just supports the fact that tree regeneration is a big concern. Native trees just are at a disadvantage given the really high deer densities.
Peter?
It's sort of a related question about the regeneration of canopy trees, and I'm wondering, in your analysis, some of these trees are too big for the deer to eat, right? So whatever's controlling their cover is not deer. So I'm wondering, in your analyses, were you focusing just on the understory species that the deer could actually browse?
Yes, I was just focusing on what's going on in the understory, although some of the species were, black cherry, maple, and oak in the understory, but those species were much more common where deer were excluded.
Yeah, and kind of related to that, I guess, it seems like, I don't know if you explicitly looked at, you just mentioned high light environments, but it seems like, the hay-scented fern is coming in, there's light reaching the fourth floor, right? So I don't know if you looked at that sort of independently.
I didn't specifically look at light environments. Yeah, so the comments I was making earlier, anecdotal. It seems that high light could increase certain invasive plants. But a lot of these unpalatable species that are more common, such as the Japanese stiltgrass and garlic mustard, are tolerant of low light, but I think they must have those anti-herbivore characteristics in order to persist, even in the face of deer. Mm-hmm.
Okay, one last question, Janice?
On your first point, there have been some studies showing that deer are dispersing a lot of these invasive plants, including Japanese stiltgrass, which was a big surprise to me. But definitely the fleshy fruited species, they're dispersing those into the forest across the landscape. As far as which species to plant, I mean, definitely put up a fence around anything you find really prized. That's what we've resorted to.
Steve, a quick question.
It might not be quick, but how does your work compare to what's happened out in other, like out in the West? There's obviously different invasive plant species there, and deer having an impact there. Have you compared this ecosystem with other ecosystems and what's happening elsewhere?
Just looking at the literature, it seems like my research is in support of or congruent with a lot of the other findings. Deer generally reduce the palatable species, increase unpalatable species, and if the unpalatable species is exotic, it definitely garners more attention. And I think what my research suggests, and especially with the hay-scented fern, and there's other literature too to back up the hay-scented fern native invader kind of point. So yeah, overall I think they're pretty similar in findings. One difference might be if not just abundant herbivores are considered, but just herbivores in general. And herbivores in general actually have somewhat different patterns. But with deer, in our case, they're very, very abundant, so it's a little bit of a different scenario when you consider a highly abundant native species, such as deer. But we can talk more about that too.
Great.
Thanks.
We're up. Thank you again, Kristine.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.